The stars had looked the same for 10,000 years. That was what made them dangerous. Commander Alara Voss had memorized them the way a surgeon memorizes anatomy, not for beauty, but for the precise knowledge of where the cutting had to happen. The star charts above the Ardennes corridor were tattooed into the back of her eyelids. She could name every gravity shadow, every debris scatter left over from the old colony ships that burned here 2 centuries ago. She could sketch the approach vectors in her sleep, had sketched them in her sleep, had woken at 3 in the morning with sweat cooling on her collarbone and the ghost of fleet disposition still burning behind her eyes. She did not look at the charts now. She looked at her coffee. It was the 3rd cup of the day, and it was barely past the 600-hour mark. The mug was stamped with the crest of the Ardennes Sector Defense Command, the eagle and planet sigil that had once meant something to the people who wore it. The coffee was terrible. She drank it slowly because the act of drinking slowly was one of the few things she still controlled. "Contact reports in," said Lieutenant Don Foss, not looking up from his console. He was 24 years old, serious in the way that young soldiers become serious when they have seen 2 or 3 things they cannot unsee. He held the datapad the way he always held bad news, flat across both palms, as if presenting it formally would soften the content. "The outer sensor buoys caught their leading formation an hour ago. They've already burned through the Corval threshold." Alara set down the mug. The Corval threshold. They'd moved it up. Every estimate from command had the Hethkali advance reaching the Corval mark in 3 weeks. They were here in 9 days. She did not say anything for a long moment. Across the command center, the night watch was rotating out, bleary officers handing off consoles to their replacements, and nobody was making the small jokes that usually accompanied the changeover. The room had a quality of sound that she associated with the period just before bad things happened. Not silence exactly, but a careful quietness. Everyone speaking a few decibels lower than usual, as if volume might attract something. "How many hulls?" she said. 19 confirmed. The buoys got partial counts on 2 more clusters before the signal clipped out. He paused. "The cluster patterns are consistent with their siege configuration. Not a raiding party." She had known it would be a siege configuration. She had known it for 6 days, had written it in her operational notes, had sent a memo to Admiral Precht at Sector Command that contained the word siege 3 times in the first paragraph. Precht had replied with a standardized acknowledgement form that his aide had probably sent. "Get me Captain Iron and the battery commanders," she said. "Not on comms. In the room." The Hethkali had been at war with the human sphere for 41 years, which meant that the people in the room had been born into the war, or had grown up inside it, and there was a generation now coming into service, Fosse's generation, that had never known anything else. 41 years. The history of the conflict could be rendered in clean phrases. First contact at the Veld system, the destruction of the colony at Marin's Reach, the slow, terrible grinding withdrawal from the outer systems as the human fleets learned, at enormous cost, what they were actually dealing with. The Hethkali were not like anything that the old theorists had imagined. They were not aggressive in the way that predators are aggressive. They were patient in a way that was almost geological, patient in a way that suggested they had long ago internalized the understanding that they would win, and that the question was only one of when and at what cost. Their fleet movements were like the movement of weather systems, enormous, difficult to alter once in motion, and governed by mathematics that their commanders seemed to understand intuitively in ways that human analysts were still trying to reverse engineer. What they could not do was improvise. It was the smallest thing. Alara had noticed it 3 years ago during the engagement at Thyssen Point, where she had been a tactical officer on the cruiser Meridian. The Hethkali had deployed a standard envelopment, a pattern she now knew by heart, had seen them run 7 times across 4 different engagements, and the Meridian's captain, a half-mad veteran named Rosso, had made a decision that was tactically insane and operationally catastrophic in theory. She had turned directly into the closing arm of the envelopment instead of retreating from it. It had worked because it wasn't in the Hethkali pattern library. They had hesitated for 11 seconds. 11 seconds was enough for the Meridian to thread through a gap that should not have been a gap. And in those 11 seconds, 3 things had happened that changed the shape of the battle entirely. Alara had been watching the tactical display with the particular focused attention of someone whose life depends on reading correctly what they are seeing, and she had watched the Hethkali fleet do something she had never seen it do before. It had paused. Not for long. Not long enough to matter strategically. Not long enough to save the 6 ships that were lost that day or to prevent the eventual withdrawal. But it had paused, and she had felt something settle into place in the back of her mind. A small, cold certainty that would take 2 years to ripen into a plan. Captain Yoon Iran arrived first, carrying his own coffee in a battered thermos that he had owned for as long as Alara had known him. He was a decade older than she was and built like a dock worker. Wide through the shoulders and slow in his movements in the way that very strong people sometimes are. Not from laziness, but from an excess of deliberateness, everything he did carrying its full weight. He had commanded the garrison's armor battalion for 3 years. He was the best tactical mind on the station, and he knew it, and did not seem to care. He looked at the star chart she had pulled up on the main display and said, "They moved it up. By 3 weeks. How's command taking it?" She handed him Fosse's datapad. He read it. He handed it back. "So we're on our own," he said. This was not a question, and it was not despair. It was the flat acknowledgement of a man who had been calculating contingencies since before the contact report arrived. "We have 11 days, Alara said. "Maybe 12 if their approach is conservative. Long enough to run the scenario I've been building." Iran looked at her with the expression he reserved for moments when he was about to say something that he knew she wouldn't want to hear. She had learned to read that expression and to let it happen, because what Iran said when he wore it was almost always true. "You're going to try to make them hesitate," he said. "I'm going to make them stop. There's a difference. I know." The battery commanders came in over the next few minutes. Yori Pak, who ran the long-range rail installations. Celine Marth, the point defense specialist. Old Sergeant Major Dhruv Sal, who was technically retired but had refused to leave when the withdrawal orders came down, and whom nobody had the heart or the authority to remove. They were 11 people in a room that smelled of recycled air and burnt coffee. And outside the room's single viewport, the stars were exactly as they had always been. Alara began to talk. The scenario she had built over 18 months existed in 3 key places. In the tactical computer's restricted partition, in a set of handwritten notes she kept in a locked drawer, and in her head. She trusted the third location most. The premise was simple. The Hethkali, in 41 years of warfare, had developed and refined a set of operational templates that had proven devastatingly effective against human fleet doctrine. They had won because they were better at large-scale pattern warfare than any human commander had managed to become. The templates were not rigid, they adapted, but they adapted within a defined parameter space, and that parameter space had never been challenged at the edges. The battle she was planning was designed to operate entirely outside the parameter space. It was not a plan to defeat the Hethkali force attacking Arden Station. 19 hulls against the garrison's 4 operational ships and fixed battery complement was not a calculation that produced victory under any standard model. She had run the numbers so many times that she could recite them in her sleep, and the numbers were unambiguous. The plan was to make the Hethkali command structure do something it had never done in 41 years of war, change its mind. "You're describing a feint within a feint," Iran said. He was at the chart table, moving icons with the deliberate economy of a man who had been moving icons around chart tables for most of his adult life. "Our forward battery group mimics a withdrawal pattern. Not a real withdrawal, a failed withdrawal. Something that looks like we're trying to pull back and losing cohesion. The Hethkali forward engagement template triggers on cohesion loss," Alara said. "They accelerate into perceived disorder. It's in the after-action data from every engagement where we've had a messy withdrawal. They push faster than their standard advance rate. Because they've learned that human disorder is real," Pak said from the far end of the table. He was small and precise, and had been the top rail systems officer in the sector before the war made rank meaningless. "Every time they've seen us look disorganized, we were disorganized." "Exactly." Alara placed 3 fingers on the chart over the coordinates she had named the throat. It was a gravitational narrowing between 2 dense asteroid clusters, the kind of approach geometry that any sensible attacking force would regard as a hazard to be bypassed. "They will not go through here under normal circumstances. Too tight for their formation integrity. Their approach algorithms flag it as a kill zone." "It is a kill zone," Marth said. "For their formation geometry, yes. Not for ours. Silence. Not the careful quiet of before, but the specific silence of people re-examining a thing they thought they understood. We're too small. Marth said. If we go into the throat to set the ambush position, we can't generate enough fire to stop 19 hulls even at point-blank range. We're not trying to stop 19 hulls. Alara moved her fingers. We're trying to stop their command ship. She had been a child of 8 when the war started, living on Arden Station itself because her father had been a hydrologist contracted to the outer processing rings, and her mother had run the station school, and there had been no reason to send a child elsewhere when elsewhere was equally safe. She remembered the day of first contact with the peculiar clarity that the mind reserves for moments of total upheaval. Not the official announcement, but the hour before it, when the adults in the station corridors had begun moving differently. A change in gait and expression so subtle that a child would not normally register it, but which she had registered because she was the sort of child who watched people the way other children watched screens. She had asked her father what was wrong. He had said very carefully that some new people had arrived in the system and that they were trying to understand what those people wanted. She had accepted this because she was 8, and her father said it with the controlled calm that she associated with things being handled. 3 days later, the outlying colony at Veld burned, and 20,000 people stopped existing, and the careful calm of the adults around her cracked in ways that could not be fully repaired. She had understood then that the calm had been something her father made, the same way he made other things, the same craft, the same effort. It had not been truth. It had been the thing he could offer her in the place of truth. She had spent the next 30 years learning how to make that thing herself. The preparation took 9 days. It would have been possible to do it in 6, but she chose 9 because she wanted the work to be invisible, and invisible work cannot be rushed. The Hethkali advance was tracked on the long-range sensors with the care of a surgeon monitoring a patient's vitals. They came in a pattern she recognized from the tactical database and from her own memory of the Corval engagement 2 years prior. A classic 3-pronged probe, the center mass slow and heavy, the flanking elements faster and lighter, everything synchronized in a way that suggested not a coordinated command, but something more like a shared understanding, a hive logic that she found more troubling the longer she studied it. They moved perfectly. That was the problem with them, always. They moved perfectly, and against perfect movement, human forces with their friction and their miscommunication, and their commanders who made bad calls at 3 in the morning, had been losing for 41 years. The war was, in its essence, a contest between the perfection of pattern and the imperfection of people, and perfection had been winning. But perfection could not imagine being wrong. That was the thing. That was the small, cold certainty she had carried since the Meridian. A force that moved in perfect patterns had no experience of error, and a thing with no experience of error had no prepared response to it. She was not planning to win this battle. She was planning to give the next commander, and the one after that, and every commander who survived long enough to study what had happened here, a single piece of intelligence that the 41-year record did not contain. What happens when you make them hesitate? On the 8th day, Sergeant Major Saul came to find her. He did this in the way he did everything, without announcement, appearing in the doorway of her office with the unhurried solidity of a man who had been walking through doorways for 60 years and expected to walk through a few more. He sat in the chair across from her desk without being invited to, which was his habit and which she had never corrected. He placed his hands on his knees. He looked at the star charts on her wall, the handwritten notes pinned beside them, the 3 coffee mugs on the corner of the desk. "My daughter's in the 3rd Fleet," he said, "at the Verano assembly point." She said nothing. She knew this. If this works, the 3rd Fleet gets clean approach vectors to the corridor within 6 months. Command's been trying to push that approach for 2 years, and the Hethkali presence in the Ardennes sector keeps blocking it. He paused. If it doesn't work, they'll still try to push the approach, but they'll lose another 2,000 people doing it. She said, "I know. I'm not asking you to guarantee anything. I've been a soldier long enough to know what guarantees are worth." He looked at his hands. They were large hands, still capable, scored with the kind of small scars that accumulated over decades of maintenance work and machinery. "I want to know if you believe it." She thought about this for a long time. Outside, the stars were unchanged. The Hethkali advance was crossing the outer marker, 12 hours to engagement. "I believe that they will stop," she said. "I believe they will stop because I have built this around the one thing they cannot model, which is a human being willing to lose correctly." She let that sit for a moment. The willingness to lose correctly is not in their pattern library. It's not in ours either, mostly. It's not a thing that wins battles. It's a thing that changes what battles mean. Saul considered this. He did not move. And if you're wrong, he said, then we lose the station and the corridor stays blocked and the Third Fleet bleeds out trying to push the approach in 2 years. She picked up the fourth coffee of the day. But I'm not wrong. He nodded once with the finality of a man closing a ledger. Then I'll make sure the battery crews are fed, he said, and stood up and left. The engagement began at the 400-hour mark, 3 minutes ahead of her projection. Hethkali tactical doctrine opened every engagement with a sensor saturation sweep, a scatter of short-range probes designed to map the defensive disposition and feed the advanced formation's targeting algorithms. It was a tell. It was the first thing she had taught the battery crews to recognize. And when it lit up the passive sensors in the pattern she expected, she felt something in her chest loosen by a fraction, the way a knot loosens when you first find the right end to pull. Sensor sweep, Foss confirmed, his voice flat with the concentration of a man reading a language he has studied intensely but has not yet dreamed in. They'll have our position in 40 seconds, Pak said. The rail batteries were already in the pre-fire orientation she had designated. 12 degrees off the bearing an enemy analyst would expect. Not enough to look intentional, enough to matter. Hold on pre-fire, Alara said. Commander, I said hold. The sensor sweep passed. The Hethkali formation read their disposition. The surface-facing batteries, the 2 small patrol ships at the near perimeter, the station's apparent defensive posture, and she watched on the tactical display as the formation began to adjust. It was like watching a chess engine calculate, except the chess engine was the size of a solar system and had 19 hulls. The center mass slowed by 6%. The flanking elements curved inward by 4 degrees. The formation was compressing into what she knew as their penetration array, not a siege posture, an assault. They were coming in fast. Good. Foss, she said. Signal the Harrier to begin the withdrawal pattern. Deviation Code 7, maximum observable. Deviation Code 7 was a sensor signature that looked like a ship suffering control system failures, a wobbling burn signature, inconsistent thrust vectoring, the electronic noise of cascading malfunctions. The Harrier's crew had practiced it for 3 days until they could perform it on demand without it looking practiced. It looked on the Hethkali sensors exactly like a ship whose crew was losing cohesion under fire. She watched the tactical display. The Hethkali forward element accelerated, right on schedule, toward the Harrier, toward the throat. Marth, she said, give them something to shoot at. Battery 4, 1 shot, deliberate miss. Make it look like we're trying to cover the Harrier. A single shot from Battery 4 crossed the approach vector without touching anything. It was the worst possible cover fire, the kind of fire that a panicking garrison throws up when their formation is already broken. It was exactly what the Hethkali pattern library expected from a deteriorating defense. The forward element pushed harder. They're in the approach funnel, Foss said, and his voice had changed. Had the tightness of a man watching something he had been told would happen, and now is watching actually happen. 19 seconds to throat entry, Pak said. The throat was not in fact mined. Alara had considered mining it and had decided against it because the Hethkali sensors would detect the mines in the approach phase, and the mines would tell them the throat was a trap, which would tell them the withdrawal was staged, which would collapse the entire scenario. The throat contained nothing except geometry, the natural constriction of 2 asteroid clusters that would compress their formation from their preferred combat interval spacing to something 40% tighter than their engagement protocols required. 40% tighter than their protocols required meant that their point defense fields would overlap. Overlapping point defense on Hethkali ships meant interference patterns in the 30 to 60 meter wavelength band that their own targeting systems used. They would be, for approximately 90 seconds, partially blind. In a perfect world, 90 seconds of partial blindness against a fixed battery defense would be enough to kill 2 or 3 hulls and damage a handful more. Against 19, it was not a knockout. Alara had never planned for a knockout. She had planned for the moment when their command ship, running the pattern it had run 1,000 times, encountered data its pattern library could not interpret. Command element entering throat, Foss said. His voice had gone very quiet. She watched the display. The Hethkali command ship. She had identified it 2 days ago from its positioning in the formation, always central, always slightly further back than the vanguard, was entering the throat on the trajectory its algorithms had calculated as optimal given everything its sensors had told it. Its sensors had told it the truth. Every piece of data it had collected was accurate. The Harrier was in genuine distress. She'd had Iron put a live power surge through the Harrier's secondary systems 10 minutes ago, enough to make the malfunction signature real enough to survive close analysis. The battery positions it had mapped were the battery positions it had mapped. What its sensors had not told it, because there was nothing to detect, was that the human commander had designed the entire engagement to achieve a single moment.
The command ship's targeting system suddenly fed interference data it had no protocol for, cross-referenced against a tactical situation that did not match any template in its library, would do something the Hethkali fleet had not done in 41 years of war.
It would query for confirmation, not a long query, not a visible hesitation, not a dramatic pause. A 3 to 5 second request to the formation's distributed command network. Is this situation what I think it is? Please confirm. 3 to 5 seconds. All batteries, Alara said. Fireplan Oscar execute. She had named the fireplan after her brother. Oscar Voss had been a pilot on the free vessel Ardenta, which had been destroyed at the Marin's Reach engagement in the 3rd year of the war. He had been 22 years old. She had been in her first year of officer training, 4 systems away, and the message had come via the official channel, with the formal phrasing that the military used for notifications of this kind, and she had read it 3 times before the words arranged themselves into meaning. She had not talked about him since then. She had his name once, in a handwritten note to herself, in the fireplan designation, and that was the full extent of the monument she permitted herself. Fireplan Oscar was not elegant. It was not the product of advanced targeting theory or novel tactical doctrine. It was the product of a specific geometry. Every battery on the station firing simultaneously at the command ship's projected center of mass at the precise moment its point defense interference was at maximum, combined with the specific timing that Alara had calculated, required the command ship to be in the throat, querying for confirmation. She had explained it to Iron as follows. In 90 seconds of partial blindness, a coordinated salvo from every battery we have will penetrate the command ship's point defense at the rate normally associated with a force 3 times our size. Not because we have a force 3 times our size, because for 3 to 5 seconds they will not be defending, they will be asking. The salvo went. She watched it on the display, the outbound signatures blooming across the tactical plot, 19 separate firing solutions converging on a single point, and for a moment the plot looked almost beautiful, the geometry of it clean and deliberate, and nothing at all like the 41 years of grinding attrition that had preceded it. The command ship's point defense activated late, not catastrophically late, not negligently late. Late in the way that a system activates when its processing is committed elsewhere when it is running a subroutine that its designers had never anticipated being interrupted. Late enough. 7 of the 19 shots in the salvo penetrated. The tactical display showed the command ship's power signature stagger and drop by 60% in 4 seconds. It did not go dark. It was not destroyed, but it was burning, and the formation around it did something she had never seen a Hethkali formation do in any engagement in any database she had ever accessed. It stopped, not for long, 9 seconds by Fosse's count. 9 seconds, in which 19 hulls sat at altered vectors, while the formation's distributed command network reordered itself around the damaged hub, while new algorithms ran their calculations, while the machine logic of a species that had been winning a war for 4 decades processed the fact that something had happened that was not in the pattern library. 9 seconds. 9 seconds, the Harrier corrected its trajectory and cleared the throat. In 9 seconds, Battery 4 and Battery 2 reloaded and re-aimed. In 9 seconds, Alara Voss took the deepest breath she had taken since the morning contact report came in and let it out slowly and said, "Now we fall back to defensive positions." By the numbers, they lost the outer battery ring. They lost the Harrier's sister ship, the Coventry, to a beam strike during the withdrawal that was more bad luck than anything else. And she felt its loss in the particular way you feel losses when you have sent people to places where bad luck happens. The Hethkali formation resumed its advance 12 minutes after the salvo, reorganized and slower, their vanguard elements running approaches that she did not recognize from any template in the database. They were improvising. It was not good improvisation. It was the improvisation of a system asked to do something it had not been designed to do, rough at the edges and overcautious in places where it should have been aggressive. But it was improvisation, and improvisation was a sign that the pattern library had encountered a limit. Ardennes Station held. Not because Alara Voss's plan had defeated the Hethkali force. It hadn't. They held the outer precincts for 18 hours before the Hethkali advanced elements established position, and they held the inner rings for another 6 after that. And when the Third Fleet's advanced elements finally arrived 30 hours into the engagement, they arrived to find a Hethkali formation that was operating below its standard efficiency rating for the first time in any recorded engagement. The after-action analysis, when it was eventually completed and distributed and read by people who were paid to understand things like this, would note 7 specific instances in the battle record where the Hethkali fleet had deviated from established operational templates. The analysis would call these deviations anomalous and would note that their cause was unclear. Alara read the analysis in a medical bay on the Third Fleet's flagship, where she had been transferred with the 18 other survivors of Ardennes Station's command group. She had 3 cracked ribs and a concussion from the strike that had taken out the command center's forward viewport, and she was reading on a datapad propped against her knee. Because the overhead light bothered her eyes, she read the 7 anomalies. She recognized each one. She could tell you, for each one, exactly what decision she had made that produced it. She thought about Rosso on the Meridian, turning into the jaws of the envelopment, and how that had been the first time she had seen the pause. She thought about Oscar, who had been 22, and had not made it out of Marin's reach, and whose name was now attached to a fire plan in the restricted tactical archive of a station that no longer existed. She thought about her father, standing in the corridor the day of first contact, making the calm that wasn't truth. She thought, they can be made to hesitate. We have always been able to make them hesitate. We just had to be willing to build the moment correctly. The debrief took 4 days. The admiral who ran it was a woman named Ekrin, angular and careful, the kind of officer who had survived long enough to become careful in exactly the ways that survival requires. She asked her questions with the precision of a person dismantling a mechanism to understand its function, and Alara answered with the same precision, laying out the architecture of the plan in full, without euphemism. On the 4th day, Admiral Ekrin set down her notes and looked at Alara for a long time without speaking. You designed this to lose the station, she said. Not accusatory, analytical. I designed it to gather intelligence that was worth more than the station, Alara said. The station was going to fall regardless. The question was what we could learn in the falling. And what did we learn? We learned that they query. Under the right conditions, their command systems pause and ask for confirmation. 3 to 5 seconds. We learned the conditions that produce the pause. She looked at the Admiral steadily. And we learned that when they improvise, they are worse at it than we are. Ekrin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You'll want to know that we've already begun distributing the after-action to the fleet tactical committees. I know. I asked Fossey to flag the anomaly sections. Fossey survived? Yes, a pause. The Corval approach the Third Fleet has been trying to push for 2 years. Your analysis suggests it's viable now. Not because the Hethkali position changed, Alara said. Because we now know what to do when they have us surrounded and outmassed, and the numbers say we've already lost. She thought about that for a moment. The shape of the idea she had been carrying since the Meridian, finally said in plain language after 3 years of living inside it. We don't need to beat them at pattern warfare, she said. We never did. We need to beat them at the thing they've never had to practice. Ekrin looked at her. Which is being wrong. Alara picked up the datapad on the tray beside her. The coffee was better on the flagship than it had been on Ardennes Station. She drank it the same way, slowly. They've been winning for 41 years. They don't know what it's like to run a calculation that returns an error. We've been losing for 41 years. She set the mug down. We know exactly what that's like. Ekrin was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and her notes and wrote something at the top of the first page and turned it so that Alara could read it. It was a single word, recommend. Outside the flagship's viewport, the stars were exactly as they had always been, indifferent and permanent and full of the long silence between things. Somewhere in the outer system, the Hethkali formation was withdrawing to regroup, carrying data it had never collected before, running analyses that its pattern library had not anticipated. Somewhere in the Third Fleet's advance elements, engineers were already looking at the Corval approach vectors with newly recalibrated models. Elara Voss looked at the stars and thought about her brother, and about her father making the calm that was not truth, and about Sergeant Major Saul's daughter in the fleet somewhere, and about the 11 seconds on the meridian when the pause had first shown her what was possible. She thought, "We were always capable of this. We were always capable of learning the shape of what we didn't know and building something that fit inside it," she thought. 41 years is a long time to carry a thing before you can finally put it down. She drank the rest of her coffee. It was, marginally, better than the last cup.